Earlier this week, managing editor at The Lever, Joel Warner, joined us on Rising to discuss reporting that the Republican governors rejecting the pardon of low-level marijuana offenders have raked in big campaign donations from the private prison industry. Let's take a listen to some of that interview.
The prisons themselves have admitted in their reports that the cannabis reforms, including the ones that the president announced a few weeks ago, are going to have an impact on their bottom lines. Literally, they will just, so many of their prison cells have been filled with the victims of the war on crime that now that we're seeing reform efforts, I think you have a lot of these large operators who are getting quite nervous. So I think what we're going to see is these private prison industries really pushing how these reform laws are going to be passed, instead of focusing on more of the prison reforms, more of pardoning low-level kind of cannabis convictions, less of expunging former kind of cannabis records. It's going to be focused more on just legalization efforts and less on actually kind of reforming some of the harms of the war on drugs in the past.
But according to a March report by the nonprofit Prison Policy Initiative, only 8% of confined persons are held in private prisons. Here's some of their data. It shows that 13,000 people are being held in local jails, 9,000 in youth systems, 16,000 for immigration enforcement, and 40,000 for the U.S. Marshals and the Bureau of Prisons, 71,000 for state prison systems. The data also show that 1 in 5 are locked up for drug offenses. The majority are being held in state prisons. Joining us now to respond is the spokesperson for Day One Alliance, Alex Wilkes. Day One Alliance is a trade association representing private sector contractors addressing correction and detention challenges in the U.S. Alex, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. We absolutely believe on this show in having good faith discussions and debates from conflicting and contrasting perspectives. So I know you objected to some of the reporting in that piece from The Lever, the guest we had earlier in the week. What is your issue with what came out of that report?
Well, a couple things, and this is often a myth that we hear in this debate, which is that somehow contractors are responsible for driving mass incarceration. And when you look at the statistics, like you just pointed out, it's mathematically untrue. It's impossible when the contractors make up 8% of the total amount of incarcerated men and women in this country. So, I mean, there are other forces that are driving those things. The contractors are not one of them. Moreover, these companies have been actively involved from the very beginning in criminal justice reform efforts like the First Step Act, Ban the Box. These were early adopters of these different initiatives because they do believe in giving people a fresh start. So and having the best possible outcomes for the people in their care.
Yeah, I do think that there's a couple of things going on here. One, Biden's plan won't actually let anybody out of prison. So, the implications there are kind of limited for any prison system, including the private prison system. And obviously, we take your point that only a small percentage of prisons in total are actually private prisons. I think that part of the reason, though, that private prisons do get a lot of attention and focus in this debate is for scandals like the one we saw, one of which just happened in August, where judges who sent children to for-profit jails for kickbacks were ordered to pay more than $200 million in damages. These two judges, Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan, shut down a county-run juvenile detention center and accepted $2.8 million in illegal payments from the builder and co-owner of 2 private prisons as part of this kickback scandal. And also, when you look at the subject of Monday's reporting, which was the money that has been given to these GOP donors who are in turn opposing Biden's criminal justice reform plan here in this instance with respect to marijuana users. There is this obvious connection that people start to draw intuitively between 3 governors raking in more than $263,000 from donors, from private prison industry donors, and their opposition to Biden's plan. So what do you say to people who see a relationship there and have skepticism about the role that private prisons are playing in this country?
Sure. Well, a couple of things. So the Day One Alliance represents the major contractors in the contractor-operated detention and correctional space. Our contractors were not involved in the case that you just mentioned, and they have long had lobbying bans on lobbying elected officials for how long somebody's sentence should or should not be. That's something that all of the member companies have long committed to. So that's certainly not true of the members of the Day One Alliance. But what I would say generally is that the member companies have given to members of both parties. They've worked with members of both parties for over 40 years now to address challenges. For example, in California, when there was unconstitutional overcrowding, it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court when Vice President Kamala Harris was AG. Contractors were brought in to help alleviate those dangerous and that dangerous overcrowding that was occurring there. So these companies have worked with members of both parties. They've given to members of both parties, and it's a tiny fraction compared to all of the millions of dollars that are spent each year. So, what our contractors are focused on is being the best possible service provider for the government, being able to come in, address challenges, have evidence-based solutions to reduce recidivism, to be able to get people into treatment. And there are in terms of the outcomes that these contractors are able to provide, they meet or exceed what public institutions are able to do.
Yeah, I think the one other concern that people have about private prisons, and I'd love you to speak to this, is that the whole point of private prisons coming into being was to basically be able to provide for a growing prison population that the state, federal prisons couldn't accommodate, and to house people at a lower cost. And people believe that certain bad statistics coming out of private prisons as compared to public prisons speak to the fact that the profit motive here is the culprit. So, for example, one statistic shows that 691 fatalities out of a much smaller total prison population, as you mentioned. There were 691 fatalities out of 138,000 inmates in a 3-year span versus publicly managed jails, which had 587 fatalities, so fewer fatalities when caring for more than 152,000 inmates, a bigger population. And I wonder if you could speak to people's concerns about the treatment of prisoners of incarcerated people in private prisons versus public prisons.
Sure, there's plenty of research out there, like I said, that shows that the outcomes that come out of contractor-operated facilities meet or exceed what public institutions are able to offer. And moreover, think about what a contractor is with the government. It's a two-way street. It's an actual contract, right? So the government sets the terms of that contract, and I think that that's something that's widely misunderstood about what we're dealing with here. People often assume that there are just two parallel systems of justice. The contractors are on the receiving end of a public adjudication of what happens in the public process, in the public arena. So they don't choose who comes to their facilities. They don't select who's there and who's not. They're on the receiving end of that, and their goal is to be the best possible service provider and to provide a savings to taxpayer and to provide great outcomes for the men and women in their care. So I mean, there are plenty of outcome-based, evidence-based studies out there that show that the contractors are able to offer better solutions in these instances than public facilities are. And I'll pose this question to you: how do you shut down a failing public institution? With the contractors, this is a two-way street. The government can end the contract. We've seen plenty of examples of horrible failing public prisons for which there is no end in sight because it is too difficult to unwind those types of situations. So in a lot of ways, there are more layers of accountability when it comes to contractor-operated facilities. I've been to some myself. Not only do you have health and safety inspections coming in from the state, you have contract compliance officers there from both the member companies and from the government who are coming in, and they're making sure that everything is being adhered to exactly to spec in the contract. So it's different. It's different in the public facilities where you just don't have that level of oversight.
Alex Wilkes, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.